Very happy to be introducing Dr. Jamal Martín here today. Dr. Martín is a faculty member at the UM School of Medicine, where he has held academic titles in internal medicine and family and community medicine. He's the former Associate Vice Chancellor of African American Health. Dr. Martín is a public health scientist practitioner with a focus on psychosocial epidemiology, and he has taught in the areas of public health equity, the sociopolitical determinants of health, and institutional change and development. Some of Dr. Martín's wide-ranging administrative, professional, and technical expertise include clinical trials in psychoneuropharmacology, international policy work with UNICEF U5 child survival programs, and health justice under WHO leadership development for primary care. Dr. Martín's work embodies a transdisciplinary and critical approach and uses mind, brain, and systems thinking to conceptualize problems concerning global health equity and structural violence. Very excited to be here today and hear from Dr. Martín. I'm sure we'll raise some very important questions. Floor is yours, Dr. Martín.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aziz Bawab. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to share this aspirational talk about this very creative title, Reimagining Global Mental Health, a future in which the primary prevention of psychopathology is achievable. And this has been a pet peeve of mine for some time in terms of where we go with this. I'm sure you folks have already seen the learning objectives for this. And I want to move from that for just a second to move to the right side of the screen, where I talk about these issues related to what I want you to know, feel, and do about this information. I want you to reimagine ways of knowing about the development of a strong likelihood for reducing structural violence and pathologies of power through decolonization of global mental health and academic medicine. Reimagine a strong likelihood for increasing one's intellectual capacity for social justice and empathy about global suffering. And last but not least, as we move from the cognitive to the affective to the psychomotor skills in doing, reimagining a strong likelihood for using global thinking, thought, and language, and the public health model for overcoming the episteme of ignorance about prevention deficit disorder in academic medicine. So without further ado, I'd like to move to this this notion here that you see, this chart here. Oops, let me go back just a second. I'm a former respiratory therapist. Yes?
We can only see like the desktop, just the icons. We don't have.
Oh, hang on a second. What happened here? Because I can certainly see.
I see your mouse on clicking on.
Okay, hang on a second.
Full screen.
Let me go to a new share.
Okay, we see it now.
How's that?
Yeah, we see them in like we see like 20. Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Okay, can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, I decided that in thinking about this, I would rely on my old skills in terms of soaping, which is something that people in the psychiatric and behavioral sciences, taking notes about a particular patient or client or a system is very important. So I thought I would do a soap with this to kind of start things off. So with my subjective, I have these comments. I'm afraid to close my eyes and sleep. I can't breathe. I have blood. They're not looking me in the eye. And a quote from Martin Luther King about of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. So the objective, pieces of this is really about human suffering under European settler colonialism and structural violence, trauma and social location and dislocation, the impact of discrimination and stress on health, disparities, obviously life expectancy, the Western culture and American exceptionalism in terms of xenophobia and national insecurity. Again, the epistemology of ignorance and epistemic apartheid. And I'm not going to get into the prevalence and incidence of morbidity and mortality across the life course trajectory as much as I'd like to, and what that looks like under neoliberal education ideology. And then the assessment, long-term history of scientific racism and biological determinism, cultural imperialism embedded in Euro-American institutions of higher education, supremacist ideology. And how do we move from treatment? And I'm not saying treatment is important, but I believe prevention is better than cure. And it was one of the reasons why I got into public health, because rather than having individual patients, the community and the world was my patient in that sense. But I'd like to talk about undoing prevention deficit disorder and talk about how that's undone by such strategies such as human rights-based approaches about respect, the right to protect and fulfill, health and all policies, systems change interventions, and theory action for a culture of health, and methodological pluralism. So I'm going to move on, and forgive me for acting like a former New Yorker, but there's a lot that I need to blaze through here. I taught a class once in environmental psychology, and this chart really sort of blew me away. This time and space characterization of people's values orientation. And if you look at the horizontal and the vertical axis of this, you'll see something very, very, very interesting. And as you look at this notion from the present in terms of time, from the present to infinity, on the horizontal axis, from self to the world, you can see here that very few people care about the world. Most of the data points center around self and family, community, state, nation, anywhere from the present to 10 years or so. But in this notion of, say, maybe from present to 1 to 5 years, people really don't give a darn about the world. So it's time to start thinking more globally about crimes against humanity and how we do, and I think that if you haven't seen the films yet, review and analyze King Leopold's Ghost, the story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa. Requiem for the American Dream and the 10 Principles of Concentration, Wealth, and Power by Noam Chomsky, and Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine. So global awareness. A lot of people don't like this notion of, and I've mentioned this before to people when I talk about the primary prevention of psychopathology, or as we talk about global issues. And yes, they are sticky problems. They're also considered wicked problems. And people feel they're too complex to define. There's no clear solution. They're socially complex, so why bother? It's intractable with chronic policy failure. They sit astride organizational boundaries and responsibilities. And I tend to think that they can be overcome. But we first have to look at the root causes of some of these things, which is the Eurocentric domination and processes and the discourses about leadership related to human capital and resources, the endemic, epidemic, and pandemic living conditions under unethical Machiavellian principles, and the pedagogy of structural violence and the need for decolonization of academic medicine. So, as we talk about this from a global level, there was a time where, and I think we're returning to that time where we look at the world in terms of the East-West divide, in terms of the global powers between the Russian Bear and the American Eagle. We're also seeing that, there's a great deal of discussion now about the North-South divide. And as you look at this, you see this notion where, the Northern Hemisphere, which takes from the global South many of the resources and things, and it puts it under that notion of oppression and social injustice with human rights violations under these geopolitical conflicts. And I guess the way to really sort of characterize this is something Martin Luther King said in one of his speeches before the year before he was assassinated, and that he said the triplets of evil is the problem of the Western society and the Western world. And he named the triplets of evil as racism, extreme materialism, consumerism, and militarism. So let's look at the characteristics and logic and ideology of this practice of settler colonialism. There's racialization, exceptionalism, expansionism, denial, elimination, and securitization. And while these are outwardly manifestations of that, people often forget with this colonization comes administrative rules in terms of guidance and governance of the nation state itself, as well as education. So we have to look at the admonishment against the uncritical use of social scientific theory as a precedent in academic training, and the problems with Western European political objectives and understanding human experiences, and those suppositions about Western European supremacy and the inferiority of African civilization or people of color. We have to involve ourselves in critiques about the intellectual and emotional roots of Western European social and behavioral culture and thought as organized principles of global mental health. And before I move to the next slide, there are a couple of things I want to mention to you folks, that as I blaze through these slides, I want you to think about hypothetical questions, devil's advocate questions, interpretive questions, and ideal questions as it relates to these notions. So as we talk about supremacist ideology and world systems and thinking about third world humanity, we'll see that colonization violently removes the colonized from the making of their history and instead makes them subordinate appendages to the colonizer's history, something I just described in the aforementioned slide. And people generally aren't accepted, if accepted, or acknowledged unless they're incorporated within the Western modernity circle. We have to have some recognition and respect for human diversity and not for polycentric egalitarian humanism as an alternative to the Hegelian spirits and universalism. There's issues related to multicultural issues, in the critique of Eurocentrism, which is the intellectual rationalization of Western modernity. And the Eurocentric Europe's reconstruction of the world, the geoculture of the modern world, so look at Wallenstein's work in 1999 and the formidable structure of cultural domination by Said. So it brings us to this dichotomy of civilized or uncivilized, civilized or barbarian. And as famous African-American professor John Henry Clark once says, civilization is the act of being civilized, and how this is extended. But this diagram to the left of all this, as we talk about this supremacist ideology, which as we get to this notion of if I'm superior, then someone else must be inferior, and if they're inferior, then I can dominate them, subordinate them, and control them. And this happens through the educational processes. And later on, this evolved into this notion of whiteness as privilege and white supremacy. And when we talk about this, we're not talking about skin color. We're talking about an ideology. We're talking about a mindset. But we have to realize that, first of all, that it's illogical, and that illogical mindset, leads to impairment and decreases intellectual development, it stagnates growth and development, and it negates democracy. As we talk about the social structures that exist within academic medicine, we'll see issues related to modern racism, structural racism, institutional racism, everyday racism, and the denial of racial dignity. And within that notion, we'll see that it leads to social iatrogenesis in terms of understanding diseases of disarray, administrative evils within the system itself. So there's hardening of the categories, there's tension headaches between treatment and prevention, which is why, I'm going to focus a lot on this notion of prevention as opposed to treatment. And if I'm invited to do another talk, I certainly like to talk a little bit more about Freud's work in psychoanalysis and Adler's work in psychoanalysis, which is another story. But then there's a hyper-commitment to training, there's cultural incompetence, there's political phobia, and there's data input obsession. The chart on the right shows you how our environments cultivate our communities and our communities nurture our health and well-being. And you look at the two trees, you see that one is obviously thriving, the other is not. And you look below the soil where the roots are, and you see why that exists, in relation to those inequities. So when inequities are high and community assets are low, health outcomes are their worst. So when you have adverse living conditions, segregation, poverty, poor quality schools, occupational hazards, institutionalized racism, marketing of tobacco and alcohol, unemployment, environmental toxins, discrimination, it leads to fragmented systems, restrictions of power, disinvestment in communities and society, disconnected members from society, and the chronic stressors from dealing with those issues lead to some of the disease conditions you see above. Whereas on the other side of this, you see the tree that's flourishing. What I want to say to you is that when inequities are low and community assets are high, health outcomes are best. And I think these two trees are a great example of something that I'm very passionate about dealing with is structural violence and how we undo structural violence. So structural violence is really about disparities, disabilities, and deaths, which result when systems, institutions, policies, or cultural beliefs meet some people's human needs and human rights at the expense of others. Structural violence creates relationships that cause secondary violence to occur. What is secondary violence? This is something we seem to focus more on, whether it's self-destruction, community destruction, or national, international destruction. The issues of self-destruction in terms of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicide, depression, internalized oppression, community destruction, crime, interpersonal violence, domestic violence, rape, national and international destruction, rebel movements, terrorism, suicide, civil wars, revolution, coups, and wars. And reactions and responses to structural violence, the secondary violence. And it just seems that we put more of our emphasis on treating secondary violence than rather getting to the root cause of it all, which is structural violence, which fits into my notion of discussions for thought in terms of how we develop our metacognition as well as metaphysics for understanding how to undo that. The problem with structural violence is that it leads to a great deal of human suffering because of poorly designed policies that yield inadequate food, housing, health, safe and just working conditions, education, economic security, clothing, family relationships, and the fact that people live a life of oppression, exclusion, exploitation, marginalization, and collective humiliation, stigmatization, repression, lack of opportunities, which is no fault of their own per se. People arm themselves to protect their commodities and access to them, overlooking connections between consumerism and oppressive regimes. Governments, financial institutions, and transnational corporations, increases in drug trade, military spending, and human rights violations. And the most vulnerable, women, children, and elders, those from different ethnic, racial, cultural, religious groups, and sexual orientation. So as we talk about this notion of destructive violence, we have to realize that as we talk about, Frantz Fanon's initial groundbreaking work, The Wretched of the Earth, we have to understand that medicine alone cannot deal with the many factors that cause ill health. In this picture, you see, an impoverished person complaining to the medical system about a nagging cough from breathing in the toxic smokes and products from poverty, injustice, caste, lack of facilities, myths, and exploitation. And this is not how we train physicians, how to deal with this work. What we can say that, with other disciplines within the medical field, physicians can become advocates for, addressing these issues. But again, with psychiatry and behavioral sciences, I think we're in a little bit more of a better position to articulate the need for change and systems transformation in these areas. So to further that notion along about what mental health and world citizenship is, the goal of mental health is to help people live with their fellows in one world. It's a condition that permits optimal physical, intellectual, emotional development. And these are definitions that took place in 1948, which is really interesting because that was the same time that, and this was a nonprofit organization, an NGO, non-governmental organization that was started after World War II, when people began to realize, the horribleness that occurred during World War II around the globe. Today, we have a similar situation where we see human security, human beings becomes more vulnerable and human security is at risk. Conflict sensitivity, societal stability, climate systems, climate sensitivity, natural resource, environmental vulnerabilities. We're at the precipice, and so as we look at the determinants of mental health and mental disorders, we have to look not only at individual attributes such as the ability to manage one's thoughts and emotions and behaviors and interactions with others, but also importantly, how do we deal with the social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental factors such as national politics, social protection, living standards, working conditions, and exposure to adversity at a young age, which is an established preventable risk factor for mental disorders. So the most vulnerable, again, for global mental health in the 21st century trends: poverty, women's mental health and well-being, children, aging population, and refugees. I'll give you a moment or so to absorb that. And I know that I'm moving fast, but I'm into my New York mode right now, moving at the speed of sound and speed of light. So I have time for conversation after this. When we talk about structural violence, we also have to realize that these are pathologies of power and place. The privileges and power associated with the ideology of whiteness and the disadvantage of color, the persistence and prevalence of racism and racial discrimination, which when we look at that, we can look at it as both process and outcomes. Divergent views about the definition and prevalence of racial ethnic discrimination. Non-whites perceived discrimination as institutional in character. And we ignore the historical legacy of the past, the idiosyncratic behavior of isolated bigot. There's institutional racism. We have to see it as a systemic set of patterns, procedures, practices, and policies within organizations, whether it's hiring, promotion, evaluation, and how that affects recruitment and promotion, what those institutional policies and organizational climate looks like. So the three levels of that really of this institutionalized racism: staff member attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors; internal climate, policies, and procedures, and influences from the communities, the public policies, institutions, whether it's regulatory, economic, political, professional, and how that shapes the context of social, political, economic context of policies, procedures, and functions. I call that administrative evil. So we have to do an analysis of oppression and the intersections of power. From the work of Franz Fanon, the psychiatrist, the take-home message here is how do we use language to completely call into question the colonial situation and what that looks like for dismantling the colonial logics of the global health industry. How do we transform spectators into privileged actors? Foucault talks about biopower in government to make worthy populations live and unworthy populations die. How do we dismantle that? Mbembe, necropower in government to kill unworthy populations while making worthy populations live. Gorse, non-reformists reform to break up, restrict, and create counterpowers that undermine foundations. And Ferrer, the radical openness to alterity and inclusiveness in decision-making with processes and voices for equal merit and consideration, regardless of the form of presentations. All of these move towards not only human rights issues, but human dignity. So decolonizing global mental health or defend the stasis. Obviously, we have to deal with othering issues that exist. We have to think about new prescriptions to make room for new language and ways of thinking, a new paradigm for humanity. And again, the outcomes must dismantle white supremacy, racism, sexism, and capitalism, excessive capitalism as elements of the global colonial situation. Decolonization through Fanon is really about the movement of departure, which can only be accomplished by the removal of the colonizer or dismantling of structures that preserve power. And we really have to talk about dismantling those structures that preserve that power, that unequal power. We have to carry out a complete overhaul of that situation through knowledge production. We have to get past this epistemic apartheid and ways of knowing and producing knowledge that undoes this, as opposed to maintaining that power and privilege. And it's important to remember that the global health industry cannot be reformed with metrics alone, checklists, and disjointed incremental steps. when I was in graduate school for my master's in public health, one of my classes in public policy, I learned an interesting term about, disjointed incrementalism. And this never works. And again, what we must address. And I mentioned the names of some of these great folks before. So with the global health, mental health, and hygiene, it's an inconvenient truth about the inequalities of power when important histories of already neglected people are marginalized. It's not a constellation of disease conditions, national health systems values, but it's about the accrued harms from national and transnational forces inimical to health, political, commercial, military, financial, diplomatic, legal, intersectional, cultural. Prima non nocere, folks. Prima non nocere. Global mental health is about power and poverty, violence and exploitation, oppression and silence, inclusion and exclusion. So Fanon's application of clinical and psychiatric education really talks about the sociodynamics and the anatomization of settler colonialism and its racism, the psychology and shame, and how medicine was co-opted as a tool for colonial powers. And the same thing, holds true for public health as a colonial tool. That has to be colonized as well. And the duties and responsibilities of intellectuals in distinguishing the links between neoliberalism and neocolonialism into a new theory of humankind and introducing humankind to the world. As we talk about this notion of structural violence, you look at the history of World War I, the Versailles Conference, and how neoliberalism and the free marketplace and just solving all the problems of the world took place is what Woodrow Wilson wanted to do for the nations coming out of Eastern Europe, no one else. But it's interesting to know that Japan at that time had argued for racial equity and was really sort of booted out of the process. And that's another story we can talk about later also too. So global mental health, when we talk about this notion of global health, mental health as a movement in 1948, we're talking about, and even so for global mental health as a biomedical process, at some point we do talk about the common humanity, but one is a study and one is a movement. And so we have to figure out how to map this territory, and get past some of these barriers. So, for example, when we talk about globalization as a study, as a discipline, and global mental health, we're talking about, the belief that, or practice, that mental disorders truly are universally constructed as a physical basis in the brain. And so, how do we deal with treatment gaps and inequalities to push, mental health care and mental health services from high-income countries to low or middle-income countries? Psychiatrization, constructs of human experience, emotional distress, problems of living, conflicts and relationships and social suffering as a mental disorder treatable by drugs. Distress is seen as symptomatic of neuropsychiatric disorders. It marginalizes traditional systems of mental health and well-being. Medical imperialism ignores culturally determined nature of mental illness that leads to inappropriate diagnosis and locally incongruent solutions. The biological determinism associated with economic agendas of the pharmaceutical industry. And the Cartesian dualisms that are deeply entangled within the meta-language of colonialism and epistemological gaze of European modernity, and the hermeneutics of stark polemics and choices, which increases contact with criminal justice systems. My work really, in epidemiology has really been a lot about, started out with infectious diseases and chronic diseases and moved to sort of understanding behavioral psychosocial issues. And I'm now incorporating more forensic epidemiology into my work in terms of public health law research to bring about, some changes in that sense too. So that I can stand as a witness for the prosecution of this nonsense. Anyway, a movement. The movement is about the concern about the biomedical psychiatry and deleterious effects of prolonged use of psychotropic drugs. The stress is seen as a response to social, political, economic conditions of conflict, entrenched social inequality and chronic poverty, political violence and environmental disasters, a lack of biological markers for mental disorders, cross-cultural validity of such psychiatric disease is based solely and problematically on Western expertise, which leads with the importance of politics and power differentials. This deconstruction and appraisal of diverse idioms of distress, the didactic methods of knowledge transfer, we need projects that utilize ways of knowing and learning that incorporate the sensorial, emotional, and the imaginary, which legitimizes modes of experience and meaning making, and challenges to move beyond the impasse of individual pathologies towards understanding societal pathology. And again, a great deal of this work started in 1919 after World War I with the International Committee for Mental Hygiene, and then in 1948 with the World Federation for Mental Health, and which also guided WHO and UNESCO. I paused for a second when I was reading number 6 about the legitimized modes of experience. And when I was an undergraduate, many books have had influence on my life and what have, but one in particular was written by a British psychiatrist, R.D. Laing, and it was called The Politics of Experience. And that really sort of opened up a new world and pathway for me to think about phenomenology and experience and philosophy in many different ways. So the next part of this really is understanding the roles of neuroplasticity and social justice and intellectual empathy in this, and how we examine mind, brain, and education science to mitigate global suffering, the role of medicalization, academic psychiatry, and power issues, and trauma-related syndromes. I really like this notion of mind, brain, and education science and neuroeducation, and the intersectionality with brain and functioning and education neuroscience and psychology and so forth and so on, and pedagogy. And I think it's a great way to shape discourse. And notice I'm talking about discourse and not debate. I used to be the director for the Peace and Justice Studies program on campus, which was solely underfunded and defunded, but that's another story. And I prefer discourse rather than debate, because when you have debate, it always leads to more conflict and frustration, which could spiral out of control. So we need to talk about discourse, intellectual discourse, and how that's used with praxis and policy and transdisciplinary studies. We need to develop a better learning culture in preventive medicine and public health, and how we build new knowledge to facilitate educational objectives, how we analyze the skills and methods for curriculum, teaching, and task, and job descriptions in team-based sciences, and overall improvements in institutional knowledge and how we transfer for sustainable collaboration interventions. I'm big on disruptive innovations. So as we talk about decolonization and dehumanization, a lot of the work focuses on the global South and representation. It's not just about altering content, but the term of discourse about the Eurocentric conception of the human. It's about dismantling processes of othering and dehumanization. And it must occur at both the epistemic and ontological levels. And so we have to acknowledge that there are many ways of being and doing with the realization of the flaws in the Eurocentric imaginary world system and Western concept, which is the geopolitical and historical realities of the human being, and talk about those notions of, references as being neutral, as being the norm, when we know that it isn't, which maintains, the status quo of power and privilege, and how humanity has been hierarchized and separated into man and the other. We got a lot of work to do in not thinking about this. So what are the basic activities in critical thinking? Investigation, interpretation, and judgment. Defining evidence that is data that will answer key questions about the issue. The evidence must be both relevant and sufficient. Interpretation, deciding what the evidence means. The interpretation must be more reasonable than competing interpretations. And judgment, reaching a conclusion about the issue, and the conclusion must meet the test of logic. So all of this really boils down to basic philosophy in some ways, in terms of metaphysical issues, epistemological issues, who produces knowledge and how it's controlled, how it's used, axiology, the study of values, and logic, what it looks like. So within this new framework for primary prevention of psychopathology, we have to think about a critical pedagogy, how, understanding and acting on how culture and power are linked, and how asymmetrical power relations between the neurosciences and education. And we can see what's happening around us daily in the world today with new movements, the neo-Confederacy, the issues related to the Great Replacement theory. There's a cultural struggle over what is acceptable as legitimate knowledge. Academic institutions function in the interest of conserving the existing political economy of capitalism and neoliberal ideas. Knowledge is both historical and contextual. The lived histories of those being researched are often ignored or perceived as a deficit. And again, we have to get past this deficit model of thinking about the other. How we disrupt the moral and intellectual bankrupt leadership of researchers deemed legitimate makers of knowledge. And again, for the future of global mental health, our praxis must link to real world problems of major power politics, whether it's the geopolitic about territory, realpolitik, military victories, ideopolitik, legitimacy vis-a-vis state building, and capital politic, the methods of inventiveness or research and development of resources, or shared of GDP for productive investments, and the construction of a research practice in support of the world. So we have to have dialectical engagement for development of a democratic voice, participation, and solidarity within the context of institutions and a larger society. Affect behavior and cognition. We know what happens when people are under tremendous stress, and what happens to the amygdala and the hippocampus, and the buildup of chronic stresses, what happens. And I want to say this, the things that we've learned about neuroscience on this level. It seems that, why people don't have intellectual empathy for the suffering of people of social justice is that the amygdala, has been hijacked. The fear network has been hijacked. And so there's a loss of intellectual empathy. We know that the amygdala is a storehouse of emotional memories, responsible for survival instincts, fight or flight, or freeze and do nothing, and different anxiety disorders, and issues that are related to, low and moderate stress levels, and how that affects the prefrontal cortex how it calms down the amygdala down by sending messages of pro and con reactions. And studies have shown us that once the fear network takes over, by and large, people basically fall into a pattern of I guess we want to label it and stigmatize it, social pathology, not so much psychopathology, but social pathology, where they don't give a darn about anybody but themselves. Benjamin Rush is kind of interesting here. I bring this up because he's considered obviously the father of, American psychiatry. He signed the Declaration of Independence. But he too fell into that trap where he described, Negroes as suffering from an affliction called negritude, which is thought to be a mild form of leprosy, among all the other issues that took place during, medical apartheid and colonization. Say, for example, if you ran away from slavery, you were considered, mentally ill, and the cure for that was to chop off a foot. But in all that, he was the co-founder of the first anti-slavery society in America. But he also observed that Africans become insane after they enter upon the toils of perpetual slavery in the West Indies. And I bring up this issue of African Americans, because they're like, the canary in the coal mine in that sense. Overcoming the colonial legacy of language and global mental health. Again, how we disrupt power dynamics sustained through colonial continuity in the practice of health sciences education. Again, it requires a critical reflection on history, identity of culture, hierarchies of power, recognizing that Anglocentrism, English language only, narrows engagement about the power dynamics, bridging the gap of language barriers that supports knowledge and co-production and equal research partnerships, and disciplinary-wide approaches and critiques are needed about the burden of history and its use are rooted in the context of that domination, dependence, and subordination. This is a chart I put together for a book chapter that I just had published, and I thought I'd throw this in here. This timeline of anti-Blackness and influenced by Eurocentric religion, race theory, scientific racism, and social science in higher education settings. From the 3rd to the 6th century, you see the early fabrications of religious literature about the Hamitic curse, that the Africans, Hamitic people were cursed with Blackness and slavery. 1775, you have Immanuel Kant, who wrote about the different races of men. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach wrote about the natural variety of mankind. In 1853, is really interesting. You have a book by Arthur de Gobineau, who really started the Aryan myth theory and the racialization of that under the Aryan myth theory in 1853, 54. You have Hegel's work, the philosophy of history. Thornton Stringfellow in America wrote Slavery's Origin, Nature, and History. Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro, Frederick Kaufman, statistician. 1907, The Negro Menace to American Civilization by Schoenfeld. William Dunning, Reconstruction, Political, Economic History, which basically set the tone for the Neo-Confederacy, being taught out of Columbia University and other places. And then there's another book that I added to this later called A World Beyond Color by Studdert, which if you've ever read Francis, oh gosh, what's the name? What's the name of the book? Francis F. Fitzgerald. When he wrote The Great Gatsby, this book by Studdert about the yellow peril and the rising of people of color around the world was a threat to whiteness and white people and supremacy. And it was a very popular book in the 1920s. And Fitzgerald wrote about it in his characters. He wrote it into the dialogue of his book. It's really kind of interesting. David Hume in 1739 talked about a treatise on human nature, the philosophical works. Again, Stringfellow in 1850, writing about examination of religious testimony of the institution of slavery. Again, ditto. American Commonwealth, written by James Bryce in 1888. This is the work that greatly influenced Woodrow Wilson's work. 1900, The Beast and Negro Beast. And again, in 1913, The Ultimate Solution of the American Negro. I say this to show you that there is a timeline to show you that how these works were embedded in religion, education, journalism, science, and everything during the Reconstruction period and on in the history of our country and adopted around the world. Like, for example, Gobineau's work on Aryanism, betrayal, trauma, broken promise, and failures. But let's talk a little bit more about scientific racism for just a moment and the issues of scientific authority and public policy. Condorcet wrote about the idea of progress as scientific explanation of social progress. So we get this idea that the science is developing these ideas that it becomes a new religion. And you can only be modern if you're doing scientific work. And that's the key to social progress. Blumenbach, who I talked about before, the authority in human skulls divided human species into 5 races. Morton, Classification of Races, and developed physical anthropology. Josiah Knott, Separation Origin of Races of Humans. Charles Darwin's Natural Selection. De Gobineau, the Aryan Master Race Theory and Race Mixing Breaks Barriers of Culture, White Supremacy, Biological Racism Issues. Galton, Nature versus Nurture. Mendel's work is the study of inheritance of certain traits in pea plants. Haeckel, who wrote Politics as how politics can now be applied to biology, and how ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Josiah Strong, wrote about how the Anglo-Saxon race has a responsibility to civilize and Christianize the world. Plotz wrote about racial hygiene, racial health, racial hygiene. Hidrlicker wrote about scientific racism, heredity, eugenics, and racial hygiene. Hooter wrote about the comparison of African babies with apes, and continued his work writing about racial stereotypes of Black athleticism, criminality. Jensen and racial IQ test scores due to genetic differences. John Philip Russian, life history, traits, and differential K theories. And there are probably more after this, but this is just a sampling of that. In how it's been embedded into issues of a long history of medical apartheid and public policy. And the aim of scientific racism is explanation of political inequality with reference to biological inequality. And now that science has been proven to be a tool, a rational tool, that uses ice cold logic to prove murder or social inequality with rational justification. Again, the list of the historical culture trauma-related syndromes for socially dislocated people of African descent, emotional contagions due to the legacy of the slave health deficit, scientific racism, negrophobia, and pigmentocracy, identity, anti-Blackness in the modern world, de jure and de facto segregation, structural violence, stigmas and institutionalized behaviors, menticide, post-traumatic slave syndrome or dysfunction disorder. Above it all, folks, the bottom line is this: we have to care for those left out. That involves reaching, pursuing, empowering, and making response to protect a reality. As we talk about philosophy, we have to note the absence of a unified field theory in science, education, and public policy. Either from Popper, Polanyi, Thomas Kuhn, Lakatos, Fariban. We need a new unified field theory. Critiques of the mainstream model: science as a political weapon, science as an ideological tool, scientific racism, globalization by marketization, the corporatization of universities and colleges. We're all familiar with DSM, and the axes that are used. We also know the DSM-5, which is launched by NIMH as a research domain criteria project, is based on 4 assumptions. The diagnostic approach based on the biology as well as the symptoms must not be constrained by the current DSM categories. Mental disorders are biological disorders involving brain circuits that implicate specific domains of cognition, emotional behavior. Each level of analysis needs to be understood across a dimension of function, and mapping the cognitive circuit and genetic aspects of mental disorders will yield new and better targets of treatment. Again, all of this is about treatment, but it has nothing to do with prevention or understanding the social and biopsychosocial issues that are related to the suffering that goes on. I'm fascinated by Dr. Pepper, not the soda, World Hypothesis in 1948. And I added a few new things to this. I modified this as I thought about his works, and I thought about how much of this fits under Western philosophy, how much fits under Eastern philosophy. And so you have this formalism, this categorical issues, whether you're either sick or well. Excuse me. Excuse me. Similarity. You have the mechanism, cause, and effect of biomedical or behavioral. It's either or. The metaphor is a machine, and the metaphor is a psychology in a sense. Then you have people thinking about the contextual relationships, the multi-causal issues. You see the multiple is singular, and the metaphor is historic events in the present. Then you have the integrated perspectives, also to the side, organism, interactive systems thinking, which I highly favor systems thinking, and seeing things as a constellation of events, and the experiential genetic history of patterns in integration. There are certain psychologists in Arizona that have formed his 4-world hypothesis into like 8 different ways of viewing this, but it's essential to think about the 21st century skills that are needed for the primary prevention of psychopathology: ways of thinking, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, decision-making, learning, tools for working, information and communication, technology, information literacy, ways of working, again, communication, collaboration, and skills for living in the world, citizenship, life and career, and personal social responsibility. And the dimensions of global learning: self-awareness, perspective taking, understanding cultural diversity, personal and social responsibility, global systems, knowledge application, and how intentionality must be integrated into this work. Just more words about global thinking as relates to this chart here, which represents what geologists are now calling the Anthropocene, and what human society has done over the last 500 to 600 years, and how, just where we are in terms of human vulnerabilities, environmental vulnerabilities, climate sensitivities, and conflict sensitivities, and how that affects our relationships, and what the tracks are for this, and keywords. Okay, coming up to the last few slides, and then we'll get into our Q&A. Again, I'm a firm believer in public health and preventive medicine. And as we talk about primary prevention, I'm really focusing on prevention strategies to deal with people most susceptible, and how do we reduce the disease incidence. Not saying that we shouldn't focus on asymptomatic people and secondary prevention, to reduce the prevalence and consequences, or tertiary prevention, dealing with symptomatic folks and reduce complications, disability. And you can substitute, primary care or secondary care, tertiary care, for hospital settings and things of that nature. But a great deal of our healthcare budget, goes into tertiary care, not even tertiary prevention in many ways. So how do we, square that circle? How do we get back to this? And how do we use this notion of thought and language for overcoming the epistemology of ignorance about prevention deficit disorder and biological reductionism, and thinking more clearly and rationally about the impact of biological reductionism and critical appraisals and observations of clinical experiences and the pragmatics of genetic loading, and chemical imbalances and non-compliance as relate to treatment and stuff. And this is still a work in progress for me, folks. But I do believe that in order for primary prevention of psychopathology to work, we do need to use this integrated public health approach with the RCA squared, root cause analysis squared. We look at the root causes, and the squared part for the analysis leads to action. So that we have to continue with our surveillance. What is the problem? Continue to identify risk factors. What is the root cause? And then develop interventions and evaluation about what works. And then implement it. How do we do it? So it's, this public health model approach is really about, taking the problem and moving towards action. And particularly in academia, we do so much for self-aggrandizement and getting published and stuff sitting on the shelf. But what good does it do to for the general people, the public who's suffering? Again, the root cause analysis basis is that a lot of times we just look at surface similarities. We just look at the above surface, what's obvious, but we never look at the rhizomatic issues, the underlying causes, the roots, And again, as we look at a root cause analysis and actions on the pathologies of power concomitant with neurosis and traumatic stresses, we have to start looking at structural violence. Not saying we spend less time on secondary violence, but we must nip this in the bud. We must look at disparities, disabilities, inequities, and deaths, when systems, institutions, policies, or cultural beliefs meet some people's human needs and human rights at the expense of others. And again, increase relationships that cause secondary violence to occur. How do we take that model and transport that public health approach? And how do we look at new ways of understanding behavioral and psychiatric epidemiology? How do we define the problem using surveillance processes? How do we identify potential causes through that analysis? And I'm at the point now where I'm thinking that we need to spend less time identifying risk and spend more time on protective factors. What are the things that people are doing well that can be supported if we get them the right resources? How do we design, develop, and evaluate effectiveness and generalizability of interventions? And how do we disseminate that? And how do we look at mental health, mental hygiene, and optimal mental functioning, and fulfill those relationships and provide people with opportunities to adapt to change and cope with adversity? And how do we reduce impaired functioning? And how do we do better at this, folks? I mean, how do we do better at this? The key social theories, for us to look about this from a global health perspective, as we move from public health to international to global health, and its geographic reach, its level of cooperation, how we deal with prevention in populations and clinical care of individuals, access to health equity among nations for all people, and a range of disciplines, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary within and beyond health. And we have to move beyond multidisciplinary because there's no integration of theories and models and constructs. They just mirror one another. We have to think about transdisciplinary works where we look beyond, across, and between the disciplines for new ideas. So in terms of global mental health, we have to think about key social theories. The unintended consequences of purpose or social actions. Again, primum non nocere. The social construction of reality. The world consists of socially constructed and culturally legitimate ideas, practices, and things. Social suffering is a framework due to socioeconomic political forces, which lead to structural violence, which cause disease, death, dying, and suffering. Social institutions, healthcare bureaucracies can make suffering worse. Pain and suffering is not limited to individuals. and collapsing the historical distinctions and framing the conditions that require both health and social policies. And then the bureaucratic rationality and the difference and the predicament of institutionalizing charismatic leadership, and the biopower model by Foucault proposed about political governance and how that increases its effect via control of bodies and populations. See a lot of this going on. Health justice theory of epi plus demos plus crassy, and the eco-social approach. Do we want closed systems or we want open systems? If we look at mechanized systems, closed systems, we look at the paradigms of Descartes and Newton, reductionism, linearity, proportionality, superpositions, and hierarchies, the paradigms of Weber, Marx, and Freud. Or do we want open adaptive systems theories in terms of adaptation, the lack of hierarchies, self-organization, emergence, the paradigms of social epidemiologists and social psychologists, again, around the people, empower to the people, epi plus demos crassy, the eco-social approach, life course, trajectory, how these conditions that, the social structural violence affects people, and people carry their history in their bodies, is embodied. What are those pathways of embodiment in terms of physical and material issues surrounded by that, the cumulative interplay and accountability in agencies, and the rationalizing centers of colonial epistemologies that impede health equity. We've seen this notion appear again and again and again. In terms of research, we have to look at multiple levels that involve multiple scales of processing, brain behavior. We have many people who focus on the molecular side of issues, people who just focus on the cellular issues. You have people who focus only on the organ systems, people only focus on the behavioral psychological issues, and some who only focus on the social environmental, knowing that chronic stresses get under the skin. But we need a new method, a new ways of looking how we correlate all of these issues into maybe possibly a unified theory that I was alluding to, and how neuroticism is a robust correlate and predictor of many different mental and physical disorders, as we talk about comorbidities, among them, the synergies, and the frequency of mental and general health service use. As Leahy says, neuroticism apparently is a predictor of the quality and longevity of our lives. So this is a new framework for research, and think about protective factors against, mental health problems and disorders, how we strengthen the families, how we strengthen individuals, how we focus on communities and social issues. It's a fascinating new paradigm to sort of be involved in. So that's pretty much it for today. There's so much to say here. So I want to show you this shift and inject a little bit of humor into this really rich, dense discourse that we're having. But I'm afraid we've had a paradigm shift. I'm hoping we had a paradigm shift and we can see things a little bit differently, and to recognize that I do this for the generations that's coming behind me. And the rest of this is just, a list of all my references, because I'm writing a case study about this. So I'm trying to keep myself in order here by looking at all of this. So that's it for now. Let me ask you a question. What did you see that's new to you that you didn't know before? So I want you to think about the effective side of these things. I want you to think about something that's new that you didn't know before for a discussion. And then I want you to think about how you felt about this information that you read. What were your emotions? What were your affective states about this information? And then a third question that I would ask of you is, how do we integrate that affective and those cognitive states together to come up with new solutions and ideas, and what our next steps are? So it is now, I've got 1 minute, and I guess we can start the Q&A.
So thanks, Dr. Martin. My name is Shashwat Pandey, and I'm a child and adolescent and addiction psychiatrist. I really, really, really enjoyed your grand rounds. I've been here 3 years, and this is probably one of my favorite ones that I've attended. But I have to say that, what I thought about it is coming from, I'm Indian American, and coming from India, which we've just surpassed China in terms of population worldwide, and it's interesting because if you look at like colonization for us, I think one of the things that your talk made me think about was how at the time when we were colonized by the English, we've been colonized throughout history, but when we were colonized by the English, the whole thing was to make us ashamed of who we were in our past and our culture, and to make us forget our own history. And our own past, and to make everything that was white or European or English centric as valued and what to covet. And And Lord McCallum actually wrote a whole treatise on that to England when he first visited before the British East India Company came. And I do think that there's this sense where we often forget our past as much as like building on the future, but we forget how much knowledge we had in our past and how much kind of expertise we had in our cultures. And even like, I know a lot of people love Indian food, but they don't realize tomatoes are not Indian. They were incorporated by the English. Like, even if you look at how like, but you know, but so I guess one of the things I thought of was first, there were a couple things. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little disorganized.
No, that's okay. I want discourse.
Yeah, the first thing I thought of was first of all, how our, you know, there is this sense too where being a child psychiatrist, I know most of the reason in the West, the most thing we focus on is fixing things with a pill. And a lot of what is wrong with kids is adverse childhood experiences, and kids with poor social determinants of health, whether it's race, class, and our sexuality, are the ones who are more likely to have more adverse childhood experiences. So for adolescents, for each adverse childhood experience you have, you're 60% more likely to take a prescription medication. And the adverse childhood experiences are, we all know those, but they're basically emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, trauma, having a parent with mental illness, parent incarcerated, domestic violence, family separation. And then social determinants of health are like race, class, gender. But I do think, you know, one thing I was thinking about too was your point about capitalism. You brought it up a little bit. And I think we've had this shift to really neoconservative capitalism, which is, it's like horrible. And there's a great documentary called The Four Horsemen. It's both on YouTube and it's on Amazon Prime. And it talks about that. It's got Noam Chomsky. It's got a few other people talking about it. But what's interesting is that I think what we lose is like, a lot of people struggle. It's not just this European centric model, but a lot of people, because of capitalism, like there's so many people who are lower class white people, lower class people. It's like these transnational corporations and the rich and the ultra rich, like make it horrible for everybody. It's not, but I do think like we are losing that. The whole reason I went into psychiatry was because it started out where it was like the biopsychosocial model. And I think, who was the person who came up with that term? It was the guy from Johns Hopkins. Starts with an M, but I'm forgetting his name. But yeah, but now we don't have that. We're trying to just focus things on a cellular level, and you can't do that in medicine. And I think I totally agree with you. It's just, and I do think though, but I think part of the reason, if you look at Eric Fromm and you look at kind of the Frankfurt School and Escape from Freedom, like the reason why we have these authoritarian leaders, because it's not only globalization that did a lot of havoc, it's also nationalism. And the reason we have these is because they prey on people who are lower class or people who are victimized. And then you have these people who identify with an authoritarian figure because it makes them feel better about themselves, even though they spew like racist ideology or really horrible ideology. And that was, I thought of a lot more stuff. Like there's another interesting thing in England where English women, when they come to America, they were all, or India, they were always treated where they would just be let through and this and that. And there's a politician in India who was at the embassy, and an Indian woman went to the English embassy. It was his relative, and they like made her disrobe. It was, they didn't cover her. It was totally, so it was just sort of, but yeah, it's like who's valued and who matters. And I think looking at things globally is much better than just looking at things through a Eurocentric or particularly American perspective. And that's kind of what your talk kind of brought up for me.
Well, thank you for your commentary. I mean, this is the type of dialogues I think that we need to have to support one another as we think about the best ways to optimize our skill sets to really make a difference. And you're right, you know, nationalism, all part of that. I think people, as you're talking about, you know, racialized capitalism, I think people would be shocked to really read what Adam Smith really said about so much of this and how it's been misinterpreted to move this to another thing. And the fact that within indigenous cultures, we've lost so much of what was useful to solving problems and things. So I'm looking forward to having more discussions with everybody as we move towards channeling our energies towards something better, because we can do better. And tell you the truth, I don't mean to put pressure on you folks, but I think psychiatrists are in a unique position as opposed to internalists, or people who are in other specialties, to really better understand this and lead the way to having more fruitful dialogues about how do we move towards peace.
Or even like our medical traditions, like in India, we have Ayurvedic medicine that's like 5,000 years old, and like there's Chinese medicine, which is really old, and like we have so much tradition, and I think a lot of the way we understand illness, like, have you read The Protest Psychosis by Jonathan Metzl? That's a great book where it talks about basically schizophrenia was always seen as like a white housewife's, like, I never promised you a rose garden in the 50s. Seen as like this docile white woman's disease. But once the Black power movement came in the 60s and 70s, pharmaceutical companies associated it with anger and hostility. So they do ads of stuff like Haldol and stuff with really angry Black men. So that's why the reason schizophrenics are seen as primarily being aggressive, even though they're 8 times more likely to be the victims of violence, and they're only twice as likely to perpetrate violence. And the only reason that's twice is because they're afraid and they're trying to protect.
Well, what we have really is the medicalization of everyday problems.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I appreciate the feedback, and it's nice to know that this case study that I'm working on, which is either going to be a book by itself or a chapter somewhere, it will prove to be useful. So thank you again for your feedback.
Thanks.
Anyone else like to share while we still have 3 minutes to?
Well, Dr. Martin, I just wanted to say it was a really a wonderful talk. I mean, I'm just thinking about some of the experiences I've had in working in communities in prevention, and I'm from the East Coast as well, and I worked in Paterson, New Jersey for a long time. Lean on me, with
Paterson, New Jersey.
With Morgan Freeman is
the New Jersey Turnpike.
Myself. There you go. But one of the things I take back in terms of like how I approach work and how I think about prevention is I remember I used to work with young adolescents in that community, predominantly in the African American community, Umoja groups, etc. And we went to go see the film I'm Not Your Negro, the famous James Baldwin. And we sat in a circle in kind of a learning space, and one of the youth, probably like 12, 13, said, why does the onus of responsibility in terms of prevention have to be placed on our backs consistently, opposed to the way in which the systems are created, right, to kind of promulgate, right, these realities, right? And meaning, why do we have to be the one to make changes in our community instead of having those in power realize that they exist, that the ways that they exist, right? Why does this exist to begin with? He kind of went on, right? And I kind of take that away of like not only a critical read of the world, right, for such a young person, right, and then but just how we think about, right, prevention as well, right, and how that Freery's work like engaging in activist-based work and like raising consciousness, etc., but also kind of doing so through that liberatory framework, but doing so in a way where we're also not perpetuating trauma, I guess is the right way of saying it. And so I kind of just think about that a lot. And
here's something else to think about
more.
We've been talking about for a decade or so now about social determinants of health. And we finally got a lot of people on board with that, but now we have to get people to think about the political determinants of health, and what that looks like, and how, those, Cicero once said, what it was, I can't think of the Latin right now, but the English is basically the role of health is the most important role of the government, something along those lines. Salus publius suprema lex esto. The health of the public is the best law of the land. And one of the things I learned by working with UNICEF and WHO in Southeast Asia and other places, that if you don't have healthy people, you can't have a healthy economy. you know, and all kinds of other things. And so there are a lot of interrelationships and things that exist with this, but the idea is to have the discussions and the dialogues and the talks. Gosh, there's so much to share here, and I know that we have so little time to do this. But you folks want to start a forum or something, I'd be happy to kind of get involved in that and work with you folks and continue to talk and have these discussions also too, about how we transform the system and change, you know, as advocates, as residents, how we ask for changes in the way that you're being trained and what it looks like to match the realities of the world itself. That's a disruptive innovation that I think is winnable.
Thanks again, Dr. Martin. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, very, very rich presentation and blazed through it, but I think a lot got, definitely very moving for people. I think we're out of time.
We're just about out of time. And again, thank you, Dr. Abdelaziz. When you mentioned this to me, I thought like, oh, great. I've been wanting to put this together for a long time and thinking about it. And so it was really truly an honor to have this, the pleasure to present this, my first draft of this. I mean, if you wouldn't believe how many slides I've got added to that list right there. I've got over 200 slides that I've been taking my old lectures and putting stuff together, revamping things. And I thought like, okay, this is that book that I've been meaning to work on and do some things.